So here's another opportunity to see this unique vehicle in the Swedish museum. This is the Sturmgeschütz Ausf, which is a 7.5 centimeter L24 cannon. And what's particularly interesting is that this is the only one that's readily available to people in Europe. This vehicle would have been manufactured about 1941, and it then was in service with the German Sturmartillery for a period of time. But what we can see on the vehicle is lots of interesting things that show that it came back for extensive repair and refurbishment. For example, there's original Zimmerit, which is the anti-magnetic mine paste, which prevents magnetic devices sticking on the vehicle. This has been coated onto the vehicle. That could only have happened in 1943 onwards for a period of about a year up till September 45. And that shows that this vehicle came back and was modernized to what was then current standards. A second thing that's of interest is that the original configuration of the engine didn't have the centrifugal air cleaning system, so dust was collected and entered the engine compartment and wore out the engines quickly. So a solution to this problem was to introduce these Filzbag pre-filters that cleaned the air before it went into the air system. And this was particularly an issue with vehicles when they were given the Schürzen armour plates on the side. Now, people will, who are studying these things will know that the Sturmgeschütz in 1941 certainly never had Schürzen, but we can see, because of this vehicle's extensive rebuilding and repair, we can see the mounting points for the brackets for the Schürzen, and there are bolt holes here for the hangers where the Schürzen were put on. So this vehicle was brought up to modern standards, except for it retained its perfectly good working gun. So it's pretty unique in that sense. It's also unique in that there is none of the short-barrel Sturmgeschütz available to see in any easy-to-find location. This has the correct set of the height of the hull, where there's one has been partially restored, which is over height. And many other features on this is absolutely original. This vehicle hit a mine at some stage, and this damaged all this area here. So this part is a short-term repair that was done, but all of this is original. The original concept of a Sturmgeschütz was that it was meant to be able to assault fortified positions like bunkers or infantry fortifications. And it had, compared to the Panzer III chassis on which it's based, it has 50mm of armour on the front right from the beginning, the 50mm here, but by 1943 that was changed and an extra 30mm plate was added on, 30mm bolted on, and a long 75 Sturmgeschütz cannon in place. And then it was the production of these was divided between the panzer troops and the Sturmartillery. The panzer troops had a vehicle that's different to the Sturmartillery, but the only feature that you know that it is different is the radio systems are totally different between the two areas of the force. The panzer troops used it as an anti-tank gun weapon, and it's probably the most successful of the German vehicles throughout the war in terms of the number of other vehicles it knocked out.
So is there anything that we could say, or at least assume, about where this vehicle could have served, since it was built in the
1941,
the
late
summer
41,
of summer of 1941, and it was in use until the end of the war. And we know that it came from Denmark, where it finally ended up with.
Yes.
But where would you say that it probably was used from built until it went back to Denmark?
Well, it certainly never went to North Africa. People sometimes assume that these Filzbag pre-filters are a sign of North Africa, but that's not the case. These were introduced really in 1943. You see them a lot on both Sturmgeschütz and on Panzer IVs, and they were really an attempt to overcome this problem that inside, when the Schützen plates were in place, the dust thrown up couldn't go out, it had to come in, and more was ingested by the engine and caused the damage. Towards the latter part of 43, they had invented a new type of air cleaner, which was a centrifugal air cleaner, which meant that they didn't need these pre-filters. But the pre-filter has nothing to do with North Africa, although the 6 of these vehicles went to North Africa, and they had an early version of that pre-cleaner on them. But this one certainly never went to North Africa. So on balance, without specific information, one would say it probably served in somewhere on the Russian front. Then having worn out, because there's no evidence of any serious impact damage, so I would say it's most likely it just wore out and had to come back for refurbishing, and then the various changes and improvements were put into place, and then because it still had its short barrel gun, it was dispatched from the Heeressäugamt to a secondary theatre where they didn't need the latest in terms of anti-tank gun performance and so forth.
It probably then went to Russian front from the beginning and then went back, and
yeah, but
maybe it didn't go back to Germany, to Denmark directly. It could have been somewhere else before it ended up in Denmark.
Yes, I mean, it could have been down in Greece or somewhere in the Balkans or in Italy or somewhere like that. But most likely, I think it would have been serviced in the Eastern Front.
Yeah, yeah. And these short barrel guns, as I understand, they were pretty much liked by the crews, but it's a short and compared to a big gun, it would have been something that you really like, but they still continue to use them. And
yes, the short-barreled L24 KWK was used right up to the end of the war, were still being manufactured, and they were being used as the armament on 251 half-tracks to provide support for infantry grenadiers, and they were used in fortress locations, and generally they were liked because they had a relatively small ammunition, so they could be loaded rather quickly, so you could keep up a very high rate of fire. They have a good performance in terms of high explosive, and they had an anti-tank gun, an anti-tank capability as well, so they were definitely of interest. Now, so I suppose if you look at the vehicle, it could have been upgunned quite easily to a long gun. Mm-hmm. That's feasible just by removing the gun, and we see on photographs some examples of them where they have been upgunned to the long gun. But obviously this one was perfectly working and was perfectly good in Denmark.
And these were made parallel with the Panzer III.
Yes, well, the Panzer III went into production first, but almost simultaneously this chassis came along. The actual chassis components are identical to a Panzer III, but as I said, this has a heavier armour, especially at the front, to protect it against incoming fire at the time. So 50 millimeters, which was unknown really in 1939 when this thing was about to enter service. So it was well protected. When they realized they needed extra armour, they bolted 30 millimeter plates onto the front and to give it that extra protection, and then eventually in 1943 they went over to 80 millimeter basic armour for the front of these, but the chassis continued on exactly the same, and it's a single torsion bar suspension like the Panzer III.